Hello, everybody. My name is Eric Trexler. I am here with the good Dr. Eric Helms, and you are watching Iron Culture presented by Mass live on this lovely Monday evening. Dr. Helms, how are we doing?
I am wearing blue and black in solidarity with you, which is in solidarity with me for 3D Muscle Journey, whether you intended that or not. I
Yeah.
saw you came on this way, and I was like, let me throw on my black sweatshirt and my grab my blue hat that I got for winning my pro card. This is the big things you can get in natural bodybuilding, folks.
Yeah.
You can get fitness brand hats. So
the
that's right.
the big achievement you've had your eye on for decades, and they're like, you know what you deserve for this? A $17 hat.
I mean, it was AUD, so 20.
Oh, okay.
You know,
There you go.
yeah.
Yeah. No, it's back in the day when I actually would like claim to be a pro natural bodybuilder in certain contexts. If I ever mentioned that around people who didn't get it, I'd be like, well, wait a minute. You don't know what that means. It means nothing what you think right now. It's basically you sink money into it. Only if you're like literally the greatest in the world could you possibly end up in the black financially. And, you get some free t-shirts and hats. And that's pretty much
Yep.
the compensation. All right, Helms. We're going to dive right into it because we had some questions in the portal here, and people were taking you to task, literally demanding a task from you. So we had not one, but two questions posted on May 18th, just yesterday. Can we get an update from Eric Helms on when the new version, the new edition of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids is going to be out? And this one actually says, hurry the F up.
Wow. I am slowly getting into George R. R. Martin territory, apparently, it seems like.
Yeah, people are honestly wondering if you will finish it, before you, what's the diplomatic way to say this, pass on.
So you may not get this reference because you probably don't read enough fantasy books. But that actually means it's more of a Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson situation. So The Wheel of Time is a book series in the fantasy genre, which spans literally generations. And unfortunately, Robert Jordan, famed author of not only Wheel of Time, but also the original Conan the Barbarian series, he made it maybe too realistic in terms of spanning that time frame because he actually did pass on before he finished that series and passed it off to Brandon Sanderson. So the good news, Trex, is that I know you haven't agreed to this, but I know you would also feel obligated if I did die in the middle of it, that you are going to finish the books for me if I don't finish them.
I would
So,
actually, I'd probably tarnish them as like a final dig. I would say, you know what, third edition, we're going in with a big red pen, and we're gonna really go off the rails with some of these recommendations. Maybe introduce some liability for your estate. Really, just dangerous, dangerous stuff
man, I love it. Just spitting on my grave. That's great.
in a fun
I should
way.
probably, in a fun way, yeah, I should probably actually answer the question though. No, I'm actually going to release these very soon. The only thing that is left to do, so just so everyone who doesn't know, we got the pyramids, they got their levels. Each level is a chapter. The introduction is written in both books, as is every single level. So the true meat, potatoes, and the vegetables and the pepper on top are actually all done. It is just the desserts, which are optional, which I have not fully finished, which consists of some of the final non-level chapters. So I have what was called the quick guide to programming in the second edition, but I think I'll just call it like the programming guide, which is basically, okay, how do you take all those recommendations? And here's an example of doing things with them. And I've actually fully written out the example bodybuilding program, and I just need to put the example powerlifting program together, which is a little more complex because it has kind of like some periodized phases. And then I'm halfway through the final appendix for the nutrition book, which has a how do you actually measure changes, assess progress via different metrics, and what type of changes do you make to your nutrition over time. And then there's also an appendix on like the competition specific process for bodybuilders and powerlifters. So peaking and recovery diet, as well as making weight for powerlifters. So we're talking probably like a week left of writing for me to do.
Wow.
But then Andy has to edit it. A lot of figures need to get made. Shout out to Anna, who does our all of our figures for MASH. She's also doing the muscle and strength pyramids. We got to decide on a cover. So realistically,
I'll
the
do it.
difference between yes, my man, perfect. I'll get back to you on that. I got to talk to Andy. But realistically, the difference between me finishing the writing and it getting published, that is probably another 2 months. So if we're at, I'm close enough to actually put some tentative dates out there. I think we will finish sometime, and they might be released by August or September.
Calling a shot. I love the bravery, followed by the extremely non-brave face for everyone watching on YouTube here.
Yeah.
Yeah, good stuff, man. It's quite an undertaking. I've always been too much of a coward to actually write a book. I have not actually written an ebook. I did write a stats guide for Mass that was
Longer than most books, so I think it
yeah.
counts.
Yeah, if we're going by fitness kind of ebook standards, then that could have fit. It could have easily been called a 2-book series, if we're being honest. But no, I've something about I think the mental hurdle of saying a book is finished. I don't know if I'd be able to really get past that unless it was like literally the only thing I was doing. I will admit for me, it's very difficult for me in writing projects to hit send and just say this is done. But yeah, so all that is to say, much respect on being so close to the finish line for the third edition, and I'm sure anyone who is interested would be making a great investment picking it up. All right, Helm, speaking of writing, last episode we talked a little bit about some of the articles we have coming up, and I don't know how much people care about a look behind the curtain, but with Mass, it's kind of an involved writing process, right? So we generally, in an ideal world where we're all better people than we are in real life, we finish our articles by like the 12th of the month for the issue that's going to go out the next month. And then we spend a lot of time reviewing each other's papers, or each other's articles, I should say, giving feedback, maybe pushing back on certain points, just beefing them up in general, doing some stress testing. So a pretty substantial peer review period, in addition to your typical kind of copy editing, figure creation, things like that. So we've got it down to a science over there. But one thing that you and I noticed in parallel is that I kind of noticed that you had a fairly spicy article this month where you were not shy about being a bit brusque, a bit short with the tongue, a little bit snippy, maybe some would say, and certainly you when we got on our call tonight, I mentioned that I made my one article a lot nicer and I instantly regret it. And you said, oh, well, I got to it after you niced it up, and I thought it was pretty cutting. So, Helms, are you doing okay? What has tapped into this very aggressive and mean-spirited side of you?
I'm old. I think
Yeah,
I just I
curmudgeonly.
feel like yeah, you get to that point. I will say it's three things. One, I was 90% kidding about being old, but 10% serious.
Yeah.
There is one nice benefit about getting older is that you are a little more comfortable with being accepted for who you are and your place in the world. And it's easier for me, I'm still not good at it, as we've talked about internally, about not paying attention to things or clapbacks or stuff on the internet. Especially when you have a more defined, can sound like, oh, I've made my decisions, I'm set in my ways. That's not what I'm saying, but I have a more defined way of, I would say, I guess, ontology, right? I've come to realize, okay, I think these are the things that we can know in the world, especially academically, and I'm certainly open to changing my approach to knowing those things. But I understand with where I operate, who I serve, and the questions I'm trying to ask. I think there is probably a relatively narrow, not narrow. There's a defined domain which I think one can justify operating in, And when someone operates completely outside of it, I'm very comfortable saying you can call yourself whatever you want, but let's be honest, you're not actually evidence based.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to call a spade in that regard. I think that's one piece. The second piece is I'm making good progress in my contest prep diet, which means, that I'm, according to the research, irritable, and generally just more angry. And I'm not quite yet at the point where I'm dumb yet. So, at least to
Yeah.
my knowledge. So that's factor two. And then I think factor three, and this might suggest that I am actually dumb. I've already forgotten by the time I brought it up, or it could be related to number one, which is that I'm old.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously I'm not nearly, I'm not anywhere near the age that you're currently at. Never will be, honestly.
Hmm.
You will be older than me for the rest of both of our lives by a very wide margin.
So that means you're going to die younger than me.
Yeah, almost certainly. I mean, come on. There's no question. Don't tell my wife that. She'll get upset, but definitely.
Is she older than you?
She is 1 year younger than me, but
Oh,
we have a whole thing going. I want to die before her and vice versa. You know, so we're trying to do the whole who draws the short straw and has to actually survive this whole thing, and I don't want it to be me.
this is not a race to the bottom that I recommend.
Yeah.
Actually, there's very few races to the bottom economically or who dies first that I think you should purposely try to win.
Well, I mean, race to the bottom has a negative connotation broadly, so point taken.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
But anyway, I'm not as old as you, and so I was doing some deep spiritual thinking, figuring out why I got so snippy, and it's because I, much to my anger, I received some feedback on the internet saying I should be a little bit more charitable when discussing this topic and the characters involved. I initially took the bait and said, you know what, maybe I should soften this up a little bit. And then after softening it up, I dug deeper and it got infinitely more pissed off than when I started. And to me, the article that you got all pissed off about is about, the role of the eccentric phase in stimulating hypertrophy, specifically, I'd say, is the brunt of the article. And so, like, obviously, it's kind of annoying to be like, come on, guys, there's so much that we could be debating and discussing and learning about. We don't need to go back and just pretend we forgot just the basic fundamentals of how this works. It's very, very annoying, and it does make you feel like, as an evidence-based content creator, you're just going to be on this hamster wheel forever of just like, oh, another shitty idea that just never should have formed if you knew anything about this stuff. But now I have to go and try to dismantle this, which takes way more effort, like by an order of magnitude than just trotting out, excuse my language, a shitty idea. Like, if the goal is to make 30 shitty ideas a day, I mean, that's not super hard. Soundly debunking 30 bad ideas a day is actually a obscenely difficult task. It's not feasible. So I get why you were upset. For me, I really dislike when bad ideas become kind of veiled or not so veiled suggestions to ignore your physician when they tell you to initiate just like standard care, like best evidence-based consensus clinical practice. So for example, if you show up to the doctor, they're going to want your LDL cholesterol to be under 100. Now, if you show up and it's 120 and you're otherwise in good health and you have no familial history of hypercholesterolemia or heart disease or early death from heart disease, and you said, you know what, give me a few months, let me try to tighten some things up, I'm going to make some adjustments, and then we'll kind of talk about whether or not additional therapies might be right for me. I don't just think that's okay. I think that's a really smart way to go. However, we've got folks who wrote this paper, and at first I wrote this article vaguely remembering them making these kind of just obscene recommendations out in the public, and someone convinced me in the comments of Front Page Fitness, which you should check out, by the way, Front Page Fitness podcast. Someone made a comment like, hey, you should be more charitable because they actually don't make those claims. And I was like, wow, I must have been way off. I must have just been caught up in my confirmation bias and being hyperbolic. Let me go soften that up. And then I went back and found them literally telling someone, like, it's so irresponsible that this doctor prescribed a statin to somebody whose LDL was 240. And it's like, no, that's standard clinical practice and absolutely the right thing to do. Now, I'm not going to pretend to give like individualized, medical stuff as if I'm a cardiologist here, but this was a cardiologist working with their patient. LDL was through the roof and they recommended a statin. Like, that's pretty standard stuff. So anyway, I was really upset because I gave the benefit of the doubt in a place where it was completely unwarranted, and I accidentally ended up being way too overly kind to folks who frankly just give reckless information and try to imply doubt where there really isn't a lot of doubt. And I think ultimately that's what kind of pisses me off about the paper in question. So the one I'm referring to is one about ketogenic diets and LDL. First of all, it was a just amateur paper. Like, it's just bad. Like, if a undergraduate student came to me and said, hey, I cooked up this idea for an undergrad thesis, and they gave me the study design, I'd say, what question are you trying to answer? And name a good question, and this does not answer it, period. So basically what they did was they took a ton of people who fit a very narrow profile. So it's one of those things where they are meticulously screening for this homogeneous sample of people with sky-high LDL. They measured their plaque accumulation over 1 year, which is not a substantial time frame if you're actually looking at arterial plaque indices and all these different metrics of plaque formation in the arteries. So you get a homogeneous group where every single person is high risk by the book. You watch them for a year and you see how much plaque accumulates. And the result was not interesting. It turns out more than it should, So you find a bunch of people with really high LDL and they accumulate plaque over a 12-month period at a rate that is not good. And nonetheless, these folks are going around talking about this paper like, see, I told you there's a lot more to this story, and maybe as long as your triglycerides are low and your HDL is high, maybe this isn't something to worry about. And it's like, well, first of all, what comparator group are you referring to here? There's no comparator group. There's no, I mean, it's fine to do observational work, but like, at least throw me a bone here and do some kind of legitimate comparisons or pull in some other data that might be comparable. But in this case, it was just like, hey, looks like on average, these folks accumulated a bunch of plaque way faster than you'd want to from what we could possibly infer over 12 months in a totally homogeneous sample. And I guess they're pretending it's interesting that not everyone accumulated the same amount of plaque over 12 months, which is not interesting. And if you really wanted to, I'm sorry, it's just not.
It's not.
No one in their right mind would have thought, I bet everyone would. It's like heterogeneity, even in homogeneous samples, is the norm. You're going to have measurement error, all sorts of factors that are going to lead into that. And frankly, if you wanted to look at like an example of like generally healthy-ish people with air quotes for people who aren't watching on YouTube, and said like, well, is there already a subpopulation of people who have really high LDL, but it's not because they're, have the whole kind of sequence of obesity, sedentary, insulin resistant, blah, 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 all down the line, this like kind of broad metabolic syndrome secondary to obesity. Is there already a population of people who may actually be like quite lean and active in some cases and still have sky high LDL? Of course there is. It's people with hereditary, genetic, familial high cholesterol levels. Do we find that, for, folks in this category, if you look at having LDL of 250 versus LDL of 350, do we have a rock solid case that there's going to be this linear relationship when you're already at like 2.5 times the high risk limit? No, not really. It looks like there's a lot of other stuff that goes into risk once you're like already in the deep end of having sky high LDL. There's no reason to believe that there should be a linear correlation up at this sky high end of these ranges. Do we find that plaque progression is uniform across the board in all people with familial hypercholesterolemia? Of course not. So there's virtually nothing interesting about this paper, and it's not designed to answer any questions. And yet I got duped into being nice about it. And I'm going to take that to the grave with me, Helms. There is still time to make edits and go back to the mean version, but I hate that I was more charitable than I should have been because someone on the internet told me to be.
I understand. And it's interesting because we've both, you go through phases of, I guess, grief when you deal with something like this. And there's there's denial, there's anger, there's, hopelessness, all that good stuff. Bargaining,
Yeah.
Where I've gotten to though is trying to understand what is going on, what's up with these people. And I think I might have a bit of an answer, which is kind of cool. And you haven't seen some of my peer review comments yet for your article, but
Right.
one of them is just, hey, you should read this paper. Because for my stage of grief, when you get to the wanting to understand how these people's brains operate, maybe you'll find it enlightening, or at least something that can calm the existential dread and the hole in our souls. So in both of our cases, we're dealing with people or the ideas, because actually the way you framed my idea, that's where I started. I was like, this is dumb. I didn't think about where it came from, and I didn't know actually who or which content creators it originated from, and I have a better idea of that now. I was like, this is a non-starter. I posted on, my first response was to post on April Fools.
Yeah, I remember that.
To say, here are the first 10, and only 10 because I can only fit 10 images into this post. Umbrella, systematic, and meta-analyses that discuss hypertrophy and have something to say about the eccentric. And guess what? The most negative thing any of them say is it's potentially just as important as the concentric. And by the way, I found 10 only going back to 2017. You want me to keep going? Because I can find 30 systematic reviews, narrative reviews, and umbrella reviews if you really want me to on the topic.
Yeah.
So my first response was, this is dumb. Let's just kill this baby right now. It should never grow up to become the world-dominating wrong idea that it could have been. So, yeah. But then I was like, oh, I found out where this came from. And I think, to be charitable, just like the people who wrote the paper that you said is, just a bad paper and amateurish, some of the people involved probably have a relatively high IQ. They're not stupid. They at least have the capacity to be rational, critical thinkers and to reason through things and perform fast processing with their noggin. So I went on a little bit of a side quest to figure out, well, what is going on here? And why is it that we have literally thousands of years of debate among scholars on what's the best way to know things. And simple things that we just don't really think about, like the evidence hierarchy or the scientific process or empiricism, actually have a tremendous amount of underlying thinking on them and why it should probably be done in certain ways. And they're literally still being debated, right?
Yeah.
And they're not even necessarily settled.
And theoretically, those, age-old debates are what every scientist should be engaged in, because
theoretically,
the vast majority of us have a PhD, a doctor of philosophy, which is basically an advanced degree in understanding the nature of knowing and the nature of developing new knowledge in blank area.
Yes.
PhD in blank. It's ultimately a philosophy degree, in theory.
And I think to some degree we can blame institutions because we've gotten further and further and further and further away from actually teaching the philosophy of science.
Yeah.
Your typical PhD program will give you a methods class, but it won't give you a philosophy of science class.
Mine had one.
Well, and you're better than most content creators. Yeah. So, and I completely think that is because you took the class and nothing to do with your capability.
Yes.
No, but in all seriousness, I think there are different personalities and also thinking styles, which are modifiable, fortunately, which relate to this. And there's an excellent paper. It is open access on PubMed, PubMed ID 37998706, by Bensley, titled Critical Thinking, Intelligence, and Unsubstantiated Beliefs in Integrative Review. because I wanted to understand how could someone who is aware of all the same research I am opt out of all of the highest quality evidence that would actually help them inform their belief and maintain it. And that's what's happening in the seed oil, like not in the people who just repeat it, like the guy like Captain Carnivore who is on trend but thinks he only needs to eat the natural diet, which is not even the natural diet, which is so I'm not talking about those guys or the people who just kind of repeat the thing on TikTok and they get their little skeleton and the rubber bands out, and they're talking about all these scientific mechanisms as to why Titan doesn't get exposed to loading during the eccentric and it just causes damage, but they've literally never read a paper about Titan or the repeated bout effect in their lives, right?
Yeah.
So not those people, because that is just people. I don't really have much of an axe to grind with them. I get it. Like finding something that is logical sounds like it makes sense, and you have cherry picked data that leads you to a conclusion, and you're young, you have not been exposed to these ideas nor all the underlying philosophy, and you go, yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable, and I have a cohesive thing that I can teach other people. I get it. But the originators, who, like you said, in your case, they've been faced with even their own evidence, which contradicts their beliefs, and they're either unwilling to engage with it, or I think in my case, they're just opting out and have a sense of hubris or superiority to I don't know if the collective work of the entire human society on maybe what's the best way to know things. Not a specific topic, but the idea of rational skepticism. Not a fan. So how does that happen? And it's especially prescient in our modern times, Trex, because I think being skeptical seems to be what these people are doing if you just kind of take a surface level view. I'm questioning what authorities have told me. I'm not going to let an appeal to an authority just because you're the government, convince me. I'm not going to just take what you've said with these recommendations, show me the data, change my mind. And I have found it difficult as a science communicator to encourage skepticism, but then also to reconcile that a lot of these people who seem to be doing that are coming to misconclusions. And there's an excellent part of this review by Bentley where they juxtapose cynicism and they juxtapose skepticism. And cynicism is just a distrust of people generally. And it comes from more of the immediate intuitive style thinking rather than the analytic style. It's almost a knee-jerk response and an assumption of, and it's not using the principle of charity, right? I distrust these things on an emotional level, and when you have an emotional response, you're not actually thinking through things on a deep level. And if something feels right and you're cynical, it's not going to go well because it can masquerade as critical thinking. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that they actually have psychological scales to measure cynicism, and they correlate with having more beliefs in the supernatural, of course, believing in more conspiracy theories, and importantly, they correlate with gullibility, which is something that we use colloquially, but if you look at actual psychology research, you can scale it. And the opposite is true when you actually have a score for critical thinking. And the final kind of really interesting thing here is that critical thinking and intelligence, like your intelligence quotient, like your processing power and speed, which is actually, unfortunately, a relatively fixed quality. There's some debate around it and how you measure it and all that. But intelligence is something that can't be changed a lot, but critical thinking, fortunately, is. So critical thinking, so like a non-very low level of intelligence protects against some of these supernatural beliefs and some of these kind of just immediate, not going to get past the gate kind of ideas. But high level of intelligence, if you're also highly cynical and you're an intuitive style thinking, it just gets you to come to a conclusion really quickly and then be able to rationalize your way to maintain it. And there's data showing that people with very high intelligence don't necessarily hold fewer supernatural or conspiratorial beliefs, but something like critical thinking does differentiate it.
Yeah.
And final thing I'll say, and then we can get into some of these questions. There was actually a really cool study that was done in an actual university setting, going back to the philosophy of science, where they had a quote-unquote control group that just, they tracked their beliefs related to the supernatural, conspiratorial beliefs, and their change over time in a people just taking typical humanities classes, or people taking research methods classes, which talked about empiricism and how to know things, but not specifically related to conspiratorial beliefs or supernatural beliefs. And then they had a class that was specifically on the philosophy of science, ontology, epistemology, and specifically challenged conspiratorial beliefs and also supernatural beliefs, and used logic and the philosophy of epistemology to try to debunk them. And there was like a 4 or 5-fold difference, where the other two groups, there was actually minimal change in some of these beliefs. But that class had a pretty substantial impact. It seemed to improve critical thinking a lot, and it had the effect of actually lowering the likelihood of holding conspiracy beliefs or supernatural beliefs. And importantly, they did a good job in that paper as well. They didn't just take whatever was considered a conspiratorial belief, because it is in fact true that some conspiracies end up being true.
Yeah, for sure.
Like if you watch a documentary on Vietnam, you're going to be like, holy shit, If you watch, a documentary on how long it took to get anti-smoking legislation passed, you're going to be like, holy shit. So they carefully made sure that it wasn't just this blanket statement of anything where people said a conspiracy, because sometimes that's the issue. If you just talk about blanket that all conspiracy beliefs are bad, people who tend to hold them will just dismiss you as not even considering it. So it was more related to things that have been known to be proven untrue, which I really liked as well, so that you could actually expose them to it rather than saying, don't be a conspiracy belief holder,
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. It's a really cool paper. People should read it. And it's an important thing to look inwardly and say, all right, am I actually being skeptical right now? Or am I being cynical about things and then actually falling for stuff? Right. And what do I need to do to be skeptical? Because it's not an emotional response. If you're feeling angry and knee-jerk responding to something, that's not what skepticism feels like.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I'm all for, challenging the status quo and trying to do science that fundamentally shifts paradigms, but you also have to be, I think the two things that are important to keep in mind when you are reading content from someone who's saying, hey, I'm doing work and I have ideas and theories that are shifting paradigms. Number one, paradigms don't shift often. The deck is stacked against you. If you believe you have a fresh idea that will shift a paradigm by a very wide margin, you're probably wrong. And that's just the nature of probability. If you tally up all the ideas that someone thought would be paradigm shifting versus the ones that actually shifted paradigms, it's a very, very skewed imbalance, right? So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that the fundamentals still count. And so for one of the things that gets me a little annoyed about this whole LDL paper that I was reading is, for no reason that's ever been laid out in a meaningful way that I've seen, the burden of proof has been just completely inverted. So we know across many, many, many populations that LDL is a pretty good predictor of atherosclerotic heart disease risk. And we know that ApoB is an even better predictor of atherosclerotic heart disease risk. And some folks came along and said, what if that didn't count? If you were lean and had low triglycerides and had high HDL? To which my response would be, yeah, what if? But do you have any reason, do you have any evidence to support the belief that that is the case? And so far the answer is well, it'd be cool if that were the case. And I'm okay. It sure would. It'd also be cool if for whatever reason it didn't apply to people with red hair. Do you
or
have
hair?
Yeah, or hair. But yeah, do you have the evidence that this specifically applies to people in red hair? No one's actually done that study. Well, there you go. That's kind of the vibe I get from this, which is well, can you show me all that literature that's been done across all these different diverse populations? Can you specifically show me that it's been replicated among people who meet these 5 criteria that I have drawn in the sand here? And the answer is, of course not, because that's a very hyper-specific question. But most importantly, the burden of proof, when you have this mountain of evidence about not just association, but causality of ApoB and heart disease risk, you have to give me more than what if we're going to pretend that it's interesting to just throw these studies out there and say, there's no comparator group that looks like a lot of plaque progression, but we're going to say it was kind of interesting and novel because not everyone was completely screwed. Doesn't really fly for me, Helms.
And it shouldn't.
Yeah.
But you know what should fly, Trex?
What?
Is the flag of appreciation for all these folks dropping all kinds of questions.
Oh, yeah.
While we've been talking about things, the best part is guess how many questions are related to anything we're saying.
None.
And yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
There's a few people have actually started.
It's good to know that we have our finger on the pulse and we are feeding them what they want.
Mm-hmm,
Now, someone did respond to generally what we've been saying. With regards to our little debate about who is going to live longer, people noted that, as I shared on Front Page Fitness recently, I was falsely diagnosed with cancer one time. So they're saying, there's no telling what the future holds for me. So absolutely, I agree with that. People talked about getting all their health and medical advice from social media, very much in line with our conversation and what we generally recommend.
Fair.
Just, pick the right social media, right? And then people mentioning that thumbnails from some of the authors of the paper I've been whinging about, they've been just peppering the internet with a lot of confirmation bias since it came out, saying, "Look at this paper. See, we did it again." And so my follow-up question would be, "Did what? Did what?" All right, but Helms, do you have any good questions happening over in the Iron? The way we do this, folks, is Helms, as the OG Iron Culture representative, he checks the Iron Culture live chat. I check the Mass Research Review live chat. What do you got going on over there?
Yeah, I've actually got kind of an interesting split of type of question, I would say. Some which would require an in-depth response, and then a bunch of really quick hit ones.
Cool.
So should we start with some longer questions?
Let's start with some quick hits. I want to get some. I want to take some cuts.
Get some wins on the board.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So there's one question, a bunch from Killer K. Do you need to deload every 4 weeks due to joint issues, random tweaks, or performance stalls? So first, we're going to go back and reject the premise. There is no specific time you're supposed to deload.
Yeah.
I think you should do it based upon when you are actually experiencing some type of need to deload, which could be any of those. If you are experiencing joint issues, you could deload. It could be a quote-unquote overuse thing, or you might need to change out some exercises or change loading, or change proximity to failure or volume. Any of those or all of those could be causing the joint issues, and they all may be on the table, but there's no, again, there's not there aren't rules as much as it would be nice if there were. And when I speak to beginners, I give much more guardrails, not because there are guardrails or should be, but because you don't know, and it's not very helpful to say there aren't rules because the gym is just a big, intimidating place, and there's a million things I could do. But those rules become constraining as you become more advanced, and I think it's just helpful to know that there are quote-unquote best practices, but they should always be applying to your context, and that's what critical thinking is. Yeah. So there is no specific answer to that one.
I agree.
Anything you want to
add? Honestly, Helms, I think there's two important things to acknowledge here. Number one, we are so far away from having enough evidence to have anything resembling a rule about deloads. It's very important to stress that point. The literature, like the focused literature that is explicitly on deloading, is almost nothing. We can pull in things from tapering and various, cessation of training and different adjustments of different variables adjusting downward. But in terms of actual research on deloads, there's almost nothing. That's not the same as nothing, but very, very few papers. Another thing I have to acknowledge is that as I keep going in this, as I age rapidly, man, I just don't view deloads the way I used to. I have found myself leaning on them less and less as a person who gives advice, as a person who, is in the gym. That's not to say that I have a hard and fast rule that you shouldn't do them, but I've had a lot of clients who, if you really nailed me down and said, how many true, genuine deloads did you have them do in a given year? The answer is going to be between 0 and 4. Usually, the ones that would fall under the umbrella of maybe technically a deload was when we knew, hey, you've got a trip coming up in 7 weeks. You'd prefer not to be in the gym during that 1 week trip, so let's train our way up to it. Maybe we even do a little bit of fun overreaching, leaning into it, and then we just take a week off. So it's not like we, grab the emergency brake because things were going off the rails and all your joints hurt and you wanted to lay in bed an extra 3 hours each morning. It was kind of just like, oh, okay, we see that on the horizon. Do we keep doing our normal stuff, which is normally what we do, or maybe we ramp up a little bit leading into that and do a little bit of a little bit of an overreach and taper type deal. But yeah, I mean, I've just, for a lot of cases, I found myself leaning less and less on deloads, with one exception. I had a client who, is this part psychological? Is it part training variables? Is it part genetic? Who knows, right? Like, this is real world in the trenches training where there's no manual that comes with each individual client, right? But his preferred approach was, after every 3 weeks of hard training, he'd say, hey, we got to do a deload every fourth week. And so as a coach, I was like, well, that's not typically what I observe. So let's try a few things. Maybe your normal status of training is just way too hard, because if someone tells me they cannot do 4 weeks in a row of training, my initial response is, what's happening in your training? Like, that seems pretty intense, like pretty fairly atypical, frankly. So we tried to mess around with some training variables and say, well, maybe this isn't a you thing. Maybe this is your training program thing. That didn't really work out very well. Could have been psychological. Maybe not. Doesn't matter. We can do a deload every fourth week and still make great progress. We did. That individual was a competitive powerlifter, and they made a lot of really good progress in the time that I was working with them. So all that is to say, you can go really heavy on the deloads, and you can go so minimal that you essentially don't do them. Everything within that spectrum is totally fine, depending on your goals and just the individualized circumstances.
I totally agree. And I would say kind of a decent heuristic is, if your training is progressive and you are relatively experienced and you're still managing to make progress, you will probably need to do something about the accumulating stress that you get from that over time. But that is a very loaded initial assumption,
right?
Because many people train 2 to 3 times a week, and let's just be realistic. There are 24 hours in a day, and there are 7 days per week. Technically, and if you were training 2 to 3 hours out of those, why do you think you would need an automatic deload? You almost certainly don't, no matter what you did in those hours, unless you just brutalized yourself. And that's very different than a bodybuilder who, if you look at surveys, on average is doing 5 to 6 training days per week and is doing 15 to 25 direct sets per muscle group, mostly to failure.
Yeah.
Progressively. So I think when you talk to people with that kind of lens, and they're telling you, yeah, you probably need to deload every, at least every 12 weeks, something like that. That's not the same as your kind of weekend warrior, where it's deload when you have developed the fatigue. And if you don't know if you've developed enough fatigue to deload, you haven't, because it's obvious. It should be obvious. And for some people, it's just not, because you have 4 days between your training sessions. It's fine. You're going to be okay. Yeah.
And I'd also say, another thing I don't want to go too long on this. This is supposed to be our little quick hits here, but
yeah, too late already. You've already ruined the thing you said you wanted.
But the other thing I would mention, just from a coaching kind of psychological perspective, is I got away from, even for the people that did need deloads and I had them, I got away from the idea. I don't think it's necessarily helpful to reinforce the premise that on schedule by the 8th week of this training block, you're going to feel like you got hit by a bus. Like, if that's our operating premise and we're actually reinforcing that in our interactions, we are biasing our ability to actually determine if you truly need something different. And for a lot of my clients, I would find that after 8 or 12 weeks of training that was progressive in nature, yes, we did need a change of pace. Yes, it was part physical, part psychological. And like I had one great powerlifting client who made incredible progress. And it was like she used to do CrossFit and then became a power lifter. And I was like, when we needed a deload, which would typically be every 8 to 12 weeks, I would say, go do CrossFit for a week. And it was still hard and fun, but it was enough of a change of pace and hit the right marks in terms of helping her recover that when she came back, she felt like $1,000,000. She would usually be stronger than, a week or two prior. And it would do all the things that a deload would do, but we just didn't, I'm going to sound like one of the pain science people here.
Do
No
it.
offense to them. They make a lot of good points. But
Become that which you hate.
yeah, I don't hate it. I don't hate it.
I know I'm fucking
But
with
I
you.
do. I'm going to talk narrative here, and I don't like the idea of suggesting that we are now for the rest of your training career locked into a sequential process of being broken down every 8 weeks and needing a week off or a week of extremely minimal activity just to tread water. I've never found that to be a helpful premise to reinforce, even if it is fairly accurate in certain contexts.
Yep, for sure. No,
All right.
I totally agree.
What do we got next here?
Okay, this one I know for sure will be short because you will have
Beautiful.
nothing to say. Any within participant design studies where individual subjects responded better to shortened training? Question mark. Should we experiment to determine if we respond more to short versus long muscle length training? Do you want to take the first crack, or would you like me to?
I'm going to protest, actually. Yeah.
So you're going to do a hunger strike,
This
you're
is
gonna
this is another area of research where I'm going to insist that the burden is on someone else to convince me that it's interesting. But go on. I'll let you do it.
fair. So I will say that there are within participant studies on this topic. None of them have shown people respond better to shortened training, but there's a big difference between seeing that at the group level and then looking at individual responses and going, oh, look at that. This arm responded better for that person, and it was contrary to the group. And more importantly, Killer K, is that doesn't necessarily mean that they would, if you repeated that protocol, get the same outcome again. So with that said, it also depends on what we mean by shortened training. If we're actually talking about only training in the lengthened or shortened position, so like a lengthened partial versus a shortened partial, or full range of motion training versus a shortened partial, the data are really clear, and you almost always see shortened partials get outperformed by lengthened partials. If we're talking about resistance profiles, though, so you're taking two different exercises, one which provides more challenge when the muscle is longer versus shorter, but they're both full range of motion, much smaller differences between groups. If you're talking about lengthened partials versus full range of motion, much less differences between groups. But yeah, there are no data which indicate actually doing shortened partials are a good idea or beneficial. It's just the degree of bad in most cases, and sometimes there's no difference. So I would not recommend. And if you did include some type of shortened partial training, it would probably be on top of your normal training as a bit of kind of a side dish. And the general reason why I don't completely just say there's no point in ever doing shortened work is an analogy which probably is wrong to some degree, but right enough that I think there's a validity enough that I'm saying it. Let's say you've got a life bar of 10 in a video game, right? And if you get to the end of the boss level and you're at 2, you're not going to be able to defeat the boss. Okay, but you get a lot of cool stuff if you defeat bosses. You get level up, more experience, coins, whatever the game is.
The
But you
rings
simply
in Sonic the
exactly,
Hedgehog.
exactly. But if you get to the boss and your life bar is low, you're probably just going to die. And the analogy here is that training in long muscle lengths, especially to failure with decent volume, it induces a high stimulus, but also a fair amount of fatigue and does have a higher recovery demand. So let's say you got this bar of 10 life, and let's just say, for hypothetical explanation's sake, that a unit of lengthened training that you plan to do is worth 4. You can only fit 2 of those in. So when you get to 8 out of 10, if you do the 4, it might set you back a little bit because you still have to recover from it. But you could maybe do a unit of 2 training. So let's say in a given week, maybe you're doing some back work and you're doing all this, really hard lengthened training, or maybe you're doing leg work, and you decide, well, you know what, I've got enough recovery capacity to get a little bit of shortened work in. I did my quote unquote Bayesian curls, I did my incline curls, I did my preacher curls, which have a hard resistance profile, but then I did some concentration curls end of the week so I could recover in time before my next bicep or back exercise. And that's going to be better than nothing, but not as bad as putting myself in the hole. So I think we don't want to abandon things that are low fatigue, low stimulus, because sometimes that's all we can give in a given schedule with the timing or the programming strategy.
Good stuff.
All right.
You have another one
You
over
got
there?
some? I mean, I got plenty, but if you want to jump into mass,
We
go for
went through a couple quick ones that were kind of recovering things we've discussed previously, but hey, fitness questions come up time and time again. Maybe you're new around here, et cetera, et cetera. So Roxy said, my husband's convinced I'm doing irreparable harm to my kidneys by eating higher protein. I cap my protein at about 0.8 grams per pound of body mass. Any long-term study showing higher protein is safe for kidney health. There is pretty ample research looking at various markers of kidney and liver health when people consume higher protein diets. We're talking double the RDA, which is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body mass, even higher than that. Plenty of studies showing that over, you name the time frame. I mean, obviously, there's not a lot of studies where they say, hey, we're going to invest tremendous resources into just watching high protein diets over the next 4 years and take regular intervals of these different, kidney tests. But there is a very robust and large body of evidence to suggest that, big caveat here, if you have no underlying pathology or medical condition impacting your kidney health, high protein diets seem to be completely fine. There does not seem to be some kind of degenerative nature to them where over time it would get worse and worse and worse. So even though you might say, well, I don't know if I feel good enough about this 3 or 6 month study, we're not even seeing things start to trend in any direction, and there's no mechanism to convince us. It's not like fatty liver where we're like, well, then it starts scarring, and now we have there's nothing progressive in nature about any proposed mechanism of this. It essentially comes from the fact that standard care, conventionally for certain kidney pathologies, has been to restrict protein strategically. But that is a treatment that is aimed at circumventing a known issue with kidney function, not because the protein caused the kidney functional impairment or kidney disease. Now, I am not a renal specialist by any means, which is why I'm not going to say which kidney conditions and whether or not that treatment is up to the standard of the most current evidence available, but that's kind of where I think it's valuable to know where this all came from in the first place. And that is historically, and I believe still for many or some kidney conditions, lower protein diets tend to be prescribed as a means of circumventing already impaired, getting around the issues of having impaired kidney function. Anything to add to that, Helms?
No, honestly, I think you did a really good job. Yeah,
Cool.
I agree with everything you said there.
We got a question that came in the portal, by the way, and I need to bring this up. I'm assuming that there's a little bit of trolling with a grain of truth to this. So I'm just now seeing the username that was provided, or the name that was provided. So the question starts, I took an arrow to the knee some 18 months back. So that grabbed my attention. It's not every day as a fitness coach that you hear people saying, I took an arrow to the knee. Maybe if you were a fitness coach in the 1500s in medieval Europe, you'd be getting a lot of arrows to the knees.
Yeah, training squires.
Yes, absolutely. Now, the only reason I make light of this, that would certainly be a very traumatic injury. The name that was provided is Black Knight. So part of me is wondering if this arrow to the knee was not actually an arrow to the knee and may have been a more conventional sports injury or an injury obtained during activities of daily living. So we're going to leave that as a controversy. We have no way of knowing, but Black Knight, the question you had was, now that you've mended after taking this arrow to the knee. You've done a lot of rehab, and now the previously injured leg is actually stronger on some accessory movements than the uninjured leg. So they must have really been hitting that rehab hard. And so the question is, do I roll with it and chase the unilateral gains that are there, or is this a sign that it should be time to switch back to bilateral work? Do you want to take a stab at this?
For sure. And taking a stab at it is appropriate, given that we're
Absolutely.
dealing with a medieval injury to Black Knight. In the future, maybe let some pass. I know you start with none shall pass. You saw what happened, arrow to the knee. You thought it was but a flesh wound, ended up being a little more than skin deep.
Yeah.
I would say it really depends on the disparity between limbs. There is not good data on at what point does a imbalance in strength between left to right or even front to back. We want to talk about like hamstring quadricep ratio, but there isn't no data. It's just that it's so challenging to actually predict injury because you have to observe injury and then you have to observe enough injuries
Yeah.
to then be able to associate it with a given outcome.
Which is a
So
beautiful thing, by the way. It's worth pointing out, like, if you're like working in applied sport and you're like, it's really hard for us to make this perfect predictive model because our guys don't get injured enough. That's a good problem to have.
yeah, or that is a good problem to have. I think also even when you do get really big data sets and you don't see strong correlations in injury, it can feel disempowering because I'll tell you what, I've been lifting for both of us have been lifting for more than 2 decades. We both had our fair share of injuries. I'll speak for myself. There are far fewer times that I can point to an injury and be like, I know what I should have done differently. Than there
Yeah.
are times when I went, I didn't see that coming. Like fuck.
Yeah, dude.
Like yeah.
When my squat was, it was right around the time I hit 500 on the squat. So let's say conservatively, my max at the time was 485, 490. I jacked up my back doing a warm up set with 185. And it's like,
Yep.
bro, the fact, honestly, and Helms, when you when you can squat 500 pounds and you're doing the intermediate warm up sets where you did the 135 and you did 185 instead of jumping up to 225, bro, you're being more than hyper conservative in your warm ups.
Yes.
And that was one where I was like, what the hell am I supposed to do? Like,
Yeah.
come on.
Yeah, and that's like 185 is typically one you skip unless there's a reason to do it. And the fact that you did it is what people think prevents injury and it caused it. So
Yeah. And you know what? If since we mentioned the ultra new age pain science folks, maybe the fact that I was being so conservative and thought I needed the intermediate 185 warm up, that's why I got hurt and experienced pain, was because I'd planted that seed of you better do all these extra cautious warm ups.
that's right. It's not even just there's no association, it's an inverse association. Doctors hate them. Everything you thought you knew was wrong.
Yeah.
But no, it's unfortunate and disempowering to just have to accept that some injuries are probably going to happen, and it's a question of when, not if, and you can't necessarily prevent them because you can't predict them, and that it is far more complex than we would like it to be. But that doesn't mean there's no data. And when we look at the cross-sectional research, yes, we're dealing with potential reverse causation. Yes, there's other things at play, and even epidemiological, cohort studies where we can look prospectively or retroactively. But the thing that does sometimes pop is that large imbalances are more common in people who are injured. Could be due to the injury, but sometimes they persist, and that predicts future injury. And since this is a specific case of someone who took an arrow to the knee and is now hoping to not get hurt in the future, I think a decent rule of thumb that has been somewhat empirically validated is trying to get it below a 10% difference in the relevant performance metric you care about, power or strength or endurance.
Yeah.
And like you'll see that in some evidence-based physio clinics that get you on the isokinetic dynamometer post-knee injury, and they want to see that eccentric and concentric get down there, and they don't want to see a massive disparity between quadricep and hamstring strength. So I would probably stick with the unilateral until you've got, strength on one side relatively like close to like 90% of the other.
Yeah, one other thing I'll mention is when it comes to like how important is asymmetry when it comes to potential injury risk. I think a really important question is what exactly are you going to be doing, right?
Yeah.
So like if you're like a person who does almost nothing athletic except for the fact that you do some bodybuilding oriented hypertrophy training, a few days a week, yeah, you could probably ride out a pretty large imbalance for a very long time before that ever surfaces as a problem. But if you play high level collegiate football or basketball and you're
Yeah.
doing sprint, stop, backpedal, sprint forward, change of direction, cut on one leg, yeah, we don't want to see a 17% imbalance. And especially if it's an imbalance that is progressive in nature or surface, we are observing it unexpectedly, where we know through repeated testing you normally have an 8% discrepancy, and you come in this morning and we just do a quick little battery of tests, and today instead of 8% it's 17%. We don't want you to go out and do a full practice. Like that's a bad idea.
Hmm.
And I'm sure some people would argue with that based on a hyper conservative or hyper null hypothesis oriented read of the literature. But I will tell you that people who have skin in the game that actually make these decisions are not sending you out there. Maybe it's too cautious, but guess what? It only takes one bad decision in that regard to set you back 9 months.
100%.
And that's not what you want.
And if you clip that and put it on the internet, people will think about you talking about something very, very different,
Yeah.
which is amazing. It only takes one bad decision to set you back 9 months. That's
Yeah.
why we cannot cut sexual education, folks.
Yeah, exactly. And then the next 18 years, don't even get me started.
Oh, yeah, tell you what.
All right. Helms. We had a
Yes.
question, a really good one here about the thermic effect of feeding.
Ooh.
So, and this is a legit question here. So, Kyle says, basically Kyle's been thinking a lot about the thermic effect of feeding, probably out on a lake, just skipping rocks, doing a lot of real deep contemplation, staying up at night, staring at the ceiling. So conventional wisdom is that we shouldn't think too hard about it, just say it's probably about 10% of our total daily energy expenditure and move on with our lives. But Kyle suggests, 10% of our expenditure is not an insignificant amount. It probably makes sense to actually consider doing things to tweak that a little bit and maybe manipulate that strategically. And so the question is why do we all just like say it's 10%, forget about it, instead of trying to like really quantify that in a more meaningful way and actually manipulate it. And my suggestion as someone who studies energy expenditure in a pretty well equipped lab, like back in the day, I did yeah, Helms is he thinks I'm flexing here. It's not my lab. They just gave me a key to it. So I'm not boasting, but back in the day when I was doing some of my earlier metabolic research, we didn't have that many tools. We didn't have a 24-hour chamber. We didn't have we didn't have like doubly labeled water capability for total daily energy expenditure. We basically had a metabolic cart, which means if you lay down for about half an hour, I can tell you your resting expenditure, and hell, maybe we get you moving for half an hour and we measure how many calories you burned in that short time frame while exercising. But when you zoom out and you have more of these tools accessible, it starts to become more clear that there are certain elements of energy expenditure that are really a pain in the butt to measure. And another thing that I'll layer on top of that is there are also some other elements of the whole calories in, calories out equation that frankly, there's such a pain in the butt to measure consistently that we just
Pun intended.
let them go. So for example, your gut nutrient extraction is not 100%. I know a lot of people oversimplify it and they say like, well, if it wasn't 100%, you'd be, having diarrhea and all sorts of GI issues and all that. That's not the case. The reality is your energy extraction from your diet is less than 100%. There is energy content that makes it into your fecal matter. And extraction rates are going to differ based on a bunch of different circumstances. They're generally in the, mid to low 90s. It's not like we're talking 40% or anything. But all that is to say, like, our whole calories in, calories out equation, like, yeah, sometimes we are going to make oversimplifications about the thermic effect of feeding. We're absolutely going to make oversimplifications about how much of the calories you ingested actually get absorbed by your body. Part of that is just a practicality. Because Helms, I mean, if you think about it, we like to tell ourselves a beautiful story, which is that carbs have this thermic effect of feeding, and fat has that thermic effect of feeding, and protein has this other thermic effect of feeding. But different protein sources, if you actually nail them down in the literature, of which is fairly sparse actually, they actually have different thermic effects of feeding. It's not as simple as saying just look at your macronutrient proportions and there it is. I mean, we have to really get down into the individual food sources, and it's just so cumbersome.
Like we have protein digestibility scores. Like, what do you think that implies?
Right.
You know, right?
Yeah.
And we even have data on some people with obesity are able to extract more energy from certain types of semi-digestible starches. You know, like
Yeah.
the I had a really fun time speaking back to that earlier question about the pyramids. Writing about fiber in 2024 is very different. Or what year is it? 2025,
Yeah.
compared to writing about it a few years ago. You can't just say soluble, non-soluble. There are some really interesting systems for how you even define fiber, and you start to realize, like, oh man, this is actually far more complex. And the classes of fiber, some of them operate similarly, some of them operate quite differently, and I found it fascinating. But
And
like,
what short chain fatty acids are they producing, and what are the physiological consequences of that?
yeah, microbiota accessible carbohydrates, max. That's like the like there's non-fermentable and then there's max. That's where we've gotten to with fiber classification, which is the most specific, but also the what, if you're not
Yeah.
familiar with kind of the new way of thinking of it. And basically, the way to think of it is that we have not only our own digestive tract that's impacting here, but the specific strains of bacteria that live in your digestive tract and the capacity they have to ferment the fiber you eat in different parts of your intestine, and how much therefore energy you can extract from it from making them into short chain fatty acids. And that is not only different between individuals, but within an individual if their diet changes for a long enough time.
Yeah.
So it's like, what fibers did you eat? And by the way, have you taken antibiotics recently? And then what did you eat for the last 10 years?
Yeah.
Like, yeah,
Because even without extreme cases like antibiotic use, like
yeah,
your microbiome, based on the methods we have currently, seems to change dramatically in a longitudinal fashion.
yes.
And so, yeah, the short version of this is it is very useful to pull the levers and twist the knobs that are pullable and twistable in an informed and guided way. When it comes to the thermic effect of feeding, I wouldn't say that we should ignore it fully. I think in certain research contexts, it may make sense to actually look at broad dietary patterns and say, you know what, maybe this group actually is, because there's such a wild difference when we compare this population and that population, maybe in terms of protein and fiber intake. Maybe we shouldn't assume that they both have 10%. But on the individual level, this is one of those areas where if you really wanted just to say, hey, I don't want to sit back and do nothing with thermic effective feeding, but it's going to be, frankly, just not practical or feasible to try to actually calculate a precise value. And even if you did, you better collect some fecal samples and measure your energy content of that too, because otherwise, why would you even bother with the thermic effective feeding calculations? But all that is to say, at the individual level, the best you can do is basically say, I'm going to eat plenty of protein. I'm going to eat plenty of fiber, but not so much that it causes GI discomfort. And hey, by the way, that's basically what everybody recommends. And to the credit of the individual asking the question, those are the two things they mentioned. It's like, it makes sense that I should eat a whole bunch of protein and fiber-rich whole foods. And like, yes, but in terms of, it's okay. I think it's adequate to just say, hey, whatever you're going to get out of the thermic effect of feeding, you're going to get by doing this, which is eating a broadly high protein, high fiber diet.
Also, if I may, I think I'm trying to think of the context in the real world where this would be something you'd think about. And let's say we're talking about the person asking the question themselves. If you are aware of the effect, if you're aware of TEF, and if you're aware that protein and fiber are impacting it, and if you're asking myself and Dr. Trexler questions, that probably means that for you, the potential swing in protein and fiber content and change from where you're at to where any other point in your career it's going to go is going to be narrow. You might be like, you know what? I was at zero point 0.7 gram per pound or 1.6 grams per pound, kilogram of protein, and I saw your guys' meta regression, and I want to diet, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try taking it up to 3 grams per kilogram. So that's a big increase in protein. But you're doing it because you're dieting. So your calories are going to come down. So your protein might increase by 50, right? And that's still probably only going to be about like 30% of the calories in your diet at most. And the total amount of calories in your diet are coming down. So maybe you manage to offset the reduction in TEF from going from a surplus to a deficit.
Yeah.
And that's probably about it. Or let's say maybe you're a trainer and you're thinking about this. This is the other time. You could have someone who you are taking them from, say, 0.3 grams per pound all the way up to 0.7. And now we're actually seeing a substantial bump. And maybe they were closer to 8% and now they're closer to 13% as TEF.
Yeah.
But when you really run the numbers, that amount is not that high. Whether we're talking like a 5% swing in TEF, I think is like at the outside the most you'd ever see in the real world, even working with Gen Pop.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I think you just have to put that into perspective. It's definitely something to leverage, and it's a good idea. And the good news is that the things that increase TEF also tend to increase satiety, appetite, and lean mass retention and diet adherence. It's a lot of good stuff. So you can't go wrong with it, but I think that component is almost like a cherry on top rather than something that is making a meaningful change.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, if you're working with a client and for whatever reason they're really excited about thermic effective feeding, it's another thing you can use to reinforce, hey, this is why we're doing blank, blank, and blank. That's not necessarily the biggest reason we're doing it, but that is a fringe benefit of what we're doing. So if it gets you more excited to hit your protein target and eat plenty of vegetables, I'm all for it, right? So there's always that kind of give and take on the coaching side of leaning into what your client is really excited and energized about and interested in without giving information that's flatly misleading, right? Mm-hmm. All right, Helms. We got a question in here.
I have a question, Trex.
Okay.
Specifically related to Riverside.
Okay.
Did you manage to live stream without hitting record?
I sure did.
Okay, cool. Just checking.
Yeah. Yeah, I forgot to. It's what I do sometimes, but we're okay.
All right.
I'll be able to get the recording from YouTube, and we'll.
I mean, we've got high quality mics. We're all right.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we'll be fine.
Okay, thank you for answering my question.
Yes, I think everyone benefited from that one for sure. Helms, taurine. Have you written about taurine in mass?
I did back in the day, and I don't necessarily even like that article because it was one study that I didn't find others to support, which I think indicated taurine might have had negative effects.
Yeah.
But there's more research on taurine now, and it's kind of neutral to positive as far as the potential effects, and there's some interesting data on longevity in it. But I would not say I am a knowledgeable person around taurine supplementation. Are you?
Not really. Someone asked if it can help with muscle soreness from playing sports. Do you remember reading anything into that? Taurine's one of the ones that I just really haven't looked into personally. So we'll put a pin in that and hopefully come back to it after doing some research. But hey, you know what, Helms? I think this is a good learning lesson. I think it's really important that the folks that you get information from, it's very important that every now and then they're willing to say, I gotta brush up on that. It's been a while, and I think for both of us, taurine hasn't really been at top of mind because let's be honest, it's not the most exciting supplement. It's not the one that's going to make the headlines. And especially lately, I've been a little bit out of I'd be curious to look back at my content and say, aside from like caffeine, I've been pretty out of supplement content for a while. I need to dive back in once some interesting stuff hits the journals. Helms, I'm gonna you can give me two numbers. That's all you can do to
Okay.
answer this question.
All right.
What loads are best for hypertrophy in terms of reps per set?
5 to 30.
5 to 30. Okay. Well, that's literally Killer K in the chat said, "What loads are best for hypertrophy?" Question mark. 5 to 30? Question mark. So there you go. The messaging is getting out there. It appears. Here's a
Oh
good.
God, I can't help myself. But it's very important to pair those with the appropriate exercises.
Yeah. Fair enough. All right. Here's a really good question that I think is frankly a good point. I don't know if I really have a good answer to it.
Hmm.
I don't know if it really demands an answer necessarily, but the question is, I know a lot of exercise studies compare interventions by matching volume, either load or sets, but it seems like it's rare for exercise studies to control for things like session RPE or total time spent training when comparing training protocols. Do you think these are things worth controlling for when trying to answer certain questions in exercise science? And this is a really interesting point that I just wanted to kind of bring about on the episode here because I find more and more that I'm giving the same responses that I hated when I was an undergraduate student and I would talk to my professors and I would like spitball with them and say, "Oh, I've been thinking like, about designing this kind of study or that kind of study, or what if we did this or that." And I felt like more often than not, they would just say, "Well, what is your research question in a very specific way?" Like don't just say you're interested in a topic. What is the extremely nuanced research question you are designing a study to address? And so I think that comes to a big distinction here, which is a lot of times, exercise science researchers are answering very specific, nuanced questions about specific training variables. And the assumption is if we learn more about how these specific variables interact or how they impact certain outcomes, then down the line, we can kind of assimilate that into a better understanding of broader training applications of how this split might work versus that split. But every now and then, it is informative in a practical sense to ask yourself just a fundamentally different set of questions than exercise science researchers are asking themselves when they're designing studies. So, for example, a lot of folks out there in the real world are not actually all that interested in, volume equated X versus Y. What they're really interested in is I'm going to train 4 days a week and I'm going to give you 45 minutes each time. Give me your best. Right. And so that's where you start to get into some of these questions where you do actually have to separate yourself from some of this research, or I wouldn't say separate from it, but you have to elaborate upon it. You have to take those findings, understand the principles of it, and then repackage it in a more applied sense. Because, yes, in the real world, most people are going to say, hey, I'm going to give you a certain level of time, effort, and frequency, and your job as the coach is to make this work for me. Those are kind of the practical questions and comparisons that people are often making. And so I just kind of wanted to highlight the fact that that is a really good question. And the reason that you don't see more of that in the research, which is, hey, we had two groups and we tried to make it, practically equivalent in terms of effort or, time spent in the gym and things like that. Those types of questions are, despite their practical importance, rarely are actually quite tight enough to address the research questions that are usually being approached. Helms, what do you have
In
to say?
exercise science would be the caveat that I
Yes.
give.
Yeah.
If you jump into the realm a little bit more on physical activity and exercise behavior,
Yeah.
you will see a fair bit more of the specific use of time spent exercising, and metrics of actually session RPE is one that they will use. But unfortunately, like the people who are asking us this question, they kind of want exercise science to do it as some of those additional metrics. But a lot of the times when we're looking at public health guidance, acceptability, difficulty, and adherence, that's where there is a lot of interest in it. Like, oh, we want to compare what we would describe as a like a complex intervention rather than actually controlling for a specific variable. So it really depends upon the like you said, the research question and even the discipline. A lot of the physical activity and exercise behavior stuff, it is what I would describe as translational research, not even necessarily applied research. Like in exercise science, we might do a mechanistic study where it's potentially just looking at a single fiber or muscle or a biopsy of what happened when we did this one thing. Okay, we understand a relationship. Then we might do in a quote unquote applied study where we do, like you described, Trex, volume matched, but frequency is different because we had this first study that showed, hey, muscle protein synthesis response is good for 48 hours. So we actually think and that we should do less volume but a higher frequency. That makes sense when we did this MPS study. So then the applied study is we took people and did 3 days a week or 6 days a week, equated volume, different frequency. Oh, we didn't see anything happen. So we're missing something else. There's more to that. Translational research is even further down the applied track because you probably, in the real world, most of the time, if you're doing a 6 day per week protocol versus 3, you're also doing higher volume. Most high frequency programs are high volume programs. But a translational study, we're not even necessarily caring about what is causing the difference. We care about which one is more likely to be acceptable and move the needle for the public health outcome we care about. And that is where you're going to see more of this. So those studies do exist, but they are probably going to be unsatisfying to the question asker.
Yeah.
Because,
yeah, it's interesting because I was chatting with someone who's talking about a study idea, and it was kind of comparing this split versus that split. And it got into those same exact questions that you were talking about. And I was like, well, what literally are you trying to compare? The best possible 3-day split versus the best possible 6-day split, the most common 3-day split versus the most common 6-day split, a 6-day split that is literally double the 3-day split in terms of volume and frequency? Or do you want to maybe try to control one of those so that the 6-day split is the same volume but different frequency? So you get into this kind of, when you start talking about training, comparing training A versus training B, that's where you have to start making these really detailed decisions about what is the question here. And like you said, Helms, in public health, a lot of times they really are focused on what is going to be acceptable and feasible to the population of interest. So they will focus more on, if we tell you to exercise for 60 minutes instead of 30, did we go too far? Is it easier to do 30 this many times versus 60 that many times? All those kind of very practical questions of application. Whereas a lot of times in exercise science, because the application questions, I think, can become so multifaceted based on the various applications. I think there is a bit of a bias, and probably a justifiable bias, to say, why don't we nail down these training variable questions and leave the more applied kind of practical applications to discerning readers who can kind of assemble the broader picture based on what we are learning about frequency and volume and intensity and et cetera.
And that final point is actually really, really critical too, because you can make you can only make certain conclusions from these different types of research projects. And most of the errors that we make in the fitness industry come from making conclusions from anecdotes and from studies that we can't based upon what we see.
Yeah.
To give you a hilarious analogy that would strike resonance with the memes that are online right now, if we wanted to do a study to see whether one gorilla or 100 men would win a fight, we would only know if we did this study multiple times whether on average the typical gorilla could beat 100 typical men or not. But you would say, but why? And we would not be able to know why unless we were measuring specific things during the fight or doing biopsies and testing these people. And what do we see in the real world? We go, well, hey, I think Mike Menser looked better than Arnold Schwarzenegger. Therefore, low volume, high intensity is better than higher volume, moderate intensity. But if we wanted to actually ask the question of which one of those two protocols is better, we would have to put a bunch of people doing those two things. And then we could say, actually, no, I think Mike Menser just responded better to training because on average in this study, higher volume, moderate intensity beat out very low volume, high intensity. So maybe one of them was on a different drug protocol, or maybe the fact that they're different people matters and it's not actually a study, right? So that's the type of thing we have to think about. Like if you look at that behavioral study that says, oh, these people did this with a higher session RPE or adherence, it doesn't necessarily tell you why. That you would have to investigate on its own, just like the other one can't be extrapolated the other way. So anyway,
Absolutely. Helms, another set of questions that I'm not prepared to answer. You ready for this one?
I'm here for you.
I keep saying I'm going to look into this one day, but it is going to be quite an undertaking because it's not my area of expertise, and it's not really adjacent either. So it's not that I wouldn't say it's inaccessible for me to do the work, to learn it, and eventually share my findings, but man, it's going to be a heavy lift. So we got one question about can we get a deep dive into microplastics and whether or not we should be concerned? And then another one was about microwaving in plastic Tupperware.
Adjacent.
Don't want to get sued by the Tupperware folks, although I think they are going bankrupt, so they probably have bigger fish to fry. I believe the Tupperware brand is going bankrupt.
Well,
So
we can just say plastics in general.
yeah,
Containers.
yeah, plastic containers. I was trying to think. It's one of those things where they're it's like Kleenex for tissues, where it's like the brand name is kind of associated with the generic product term. But either way, man, I'm not really a material scientist, and that you kind of need a decent background in what these things are made of, what their characteristics are in terms of leaching, what specifically is leaching, how is that processed, or what is its life cycle within the human body, what physiological implications does that have? Yeah,
You know what you are though, Trex, is one of the cross-disciplinary capabilities that is necessary is the ability to assess whether or not a meta-analysis is valid. You
yeah,
do have that, and I think if we wanted to bring to the people a fairly unlikely to be wrong perspective on microplastics that is up to date and
yeah,
relatively comprehensive and not just based upon one study. I know what I would do. I would probably jump into Google Scholar and I would type in some key terms like umbrella, meta-analysis, systematic, and microplastics, and all-cause mortality,
So you think
metabolic
umbrellas are
disease.
systematically putting microplastics in us and causing mortality?
No, I think they're actually the breakdown of umbrellas,
Yeah,
which often have plastic components in
yeah,
them. I think it's specifically umbrella plastic
yeah.
that is getting into
Okay,
our bodies.
yeah.
Yeah, especially with acid rain, and then probably just you might not need to eat it. Just using an umbrella.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go out into the rain tomorrow without an umbrella.
The thing that sucks about this is like I don't like I don't like tiptoeing into these areas because like man, it makes me feel so powerless. Like for example, I just came across a
This is
paper.
now a therapy session for your existential crisis. I
Oh no,
love it.
I just came across a paper the other day, and I'm not gonna like say I did not do a rigorous review of it, but it was a paper published by people who seem like they know what they're doing. It had all this, gave off all the vibes of a high quality paper, but again, I didn't read it thoroughly. But it was like talking about your risk of Parkinson's if you happen to live within a certain mileage of a golf course. And the take home point was not positive. And it was like, well, there are all this stuff and it leaches into the groundwater. And these are in areas where there's a lot of like, kind of, residential wells that people are using. Like this water's not actually like going through processing plants. And like, I don't know, I get my water out of a well. I don't know what the hell's going on out here.
Just get bottled water in microplastic containers. You'll be fine.
Exactly. Yeah. And like I don't know. I like to I'm being facetious here, but there's when it comes to microplastics, I am holding out hope. That is kind of facetious, but Helms, I don't know if you heard about this. There was a big story that researchers were looking for all the plastic that should be in the ocean. Like mathematically, it's been calculated. We think this much should be out there. And they were struggling to find it. And they have proposed, and I think this is true, but again, this is where I'm just doing like the pop psychology crap I don't understand, not looking into it because what am I going to do with this information anyway? So please separate this from the typical rigorous evidence-based content.
Mm-hmm.
This is just me saying, hey, I heard a headline about this. That sounds cool. But
This is front page fitness now. Here's where we're at.
No,
Wow.
I actually am also rigorous with that as well. So this is just me being like, at the water cooler, hey, did you see that headline the other day? But I have heard on good authority, that is not my authority, that they were struggling to find all the plastic that's supposed to be out there in the ocean, and found that there were some organisms that had kind of seemed to be actually consuming and metabolizing some of this plastic, and in a way kind of doing the environment a solid in the process of doing so. So to the extent that that's true, which I hope it is, seems like a nice thing if we can swing it as a planet. Maybe there's some of these weird little microbes in us that are going to just eat away all of our plastic, and, all the scary headlines about how you have like a credit card worth of plastic sitting in your body, in aggregate, obviously not in a single location. I feel like you'd know if you had a whole credit card. Yeah. But, I don't know. I'm going to facetiously hold out hope that my body will develop systems to just metabolize that plastic. And maybe it has a high thermic effect of feeding. Maybe it'll help me, get a little more trim for the summer.
Well, I think we should end on you wildly speculating based upon pop news that you haven't thought about at all.
Yeah.
And I will take it further, and I will do what most science communicators do, where they hear about a wild speculation, and then they go ahead and speculate about that wild speculation without checking their facts. And I will say, well, since we have it on good authority that the research shows that there are organisms in the ocean that are taking care of plastics for us, the good news, folks, is if you eat fish and if you eat seafood, you will be also consuming, and seaweed, those microorganisms, and they will also detoxify the microplastics out of your body.
Yeah.
So that's I have now done the responsible science communication thing and played telephone with an unsubstantiated claim to then leap to an unsubstantiated recommendation.
I've also been littering a lot more, because when you think about it,
into the ocean.
Yeah, like whenever I go to the beach, it's a few hours away. I actually, like people go out and like feed the ducks at a pond. I just toss plastic into the ocean now that I know that there's things out there that need it. I want to make sure they're taken care of. So I go out and feed. I just bring a bunch of like Diet Mountain Dew bottles, and as I finish them, just toss them out into the water. So it's all that circle of life, food web, all that stuff.
It's a beautiful thing. Buying Tupperware and just throwing it in the ocean en masse.
Yeah. Beautiful. All right, Helms. I think that does it for tonight. You feel good about what you've done?
I do not feel good at all about the last 5 minutes, but what's done is done. So we're just going to move on.
It was live, so we can't pretend it didn't happen.
That's right.
No, I will actually. I'm making a commitment live on air. I will look into this stuff. I will fact check the reckless crap I just did for the last 5 minutes in the next episode. I will fact check that, and I will try to find something interesting that seems reliable about microplastics and broader health effects. That's going to be ambitious. I'm not ready to commit to writing a whole article on it because that's even more ambitious, but I commit that treat all of the reckless speculation of the last 5 minutes just to help Helms sleep for the next 7 days. Treat that as essentially a cliffhanger or appetizer or a simple teaser trailer for next week where we will actually do homework and bring interesting things to the table. How does that sound?
And I'll hold your feet to the fire. Next time we do a live episode, I'm going to ask you about microplastics.
Okay, it'll be 1 week
let's get a
from
guest
today.
lined up. Yeah,
We'll just do guests for the next 8 months. That'd be yeah.
That's right.
All right. Well, Helms, as always, thank you for being my co-pilot here. Everyone in the live chat, thanks so much for participating. Really appreciate it. The show literally wouldn't exist without you folks. Bringing all the good questions every week. Of course, also want to thank folks who are in the after hours question portal. You can submit questions anytime you like by going to massresearchreview.com/ironculture. That's where you submit those questions. Of course, if you like the show, many ways to support it. You can like, rate, subscribe, review, share it with a friend, all that kind of stuff. And if you really love what we're doing, remember, Iron Culture is brought to you by the Mass Research Review, where we actually talk about science we understand. We don't recklessly talk about mysterious creatures in the ocean that may or may not eat our plastic that we're feeding it. So if you want us to stay within our lane and give you real rigorous information about training, nutrition, physical activity, psychology, all those adjacent topics that fit under the fitness and health and wellness umbrella, massresearchreview.com is where you can find out more, and you can become a member of the Mass community. So everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Have a fantastic week, and we will be back in 7 days.